Love your enemies is advanced master level compassion work. And that is where we are today in our last look at Karen Armstrong's book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. So if you've been following along what we've been doing this summer or not, here's a brief outline of where we've been. We've learned about compassion. We have looked to see where it is and where it is not in our world. We have tried to find compassion for ourselves. We tried to cultivate empathy for others, mindfulness for the moments we live in, and action that made compassionate differences in our lives. We have challenged ourselves about how little we really know, and we have thought about how we should speak to others. The Buddhists call right speech. And we wondered if we could really have concern for everybody and how many we could hold. And we have thought about knowledge and where we could admit we were ignorant or prejudiced. And we have talked about recognizing suffering and holding those who are strangers in our lives with a compassionate embrace. And now we are supposed to love our enemies. Admittedly, most of us engaged in this work are way back at about week 3 or 4, just trying to love ourselves enough to move forward. So today we are asked to heed the ancient commandment to love our enemies. A terrible burden to carry this as a sermon all week. My first reaction to today's task was just to take a breath and step back from the love your enemies ledge and say, I learned a lot this summer, actually, about myself, about how to make compassion more present in me and in my life. I learned a bit about forgiving myself when I fail, but still pursuing compassion with resolve. The book has worked on me, and the practical reminder that this is a life's work is reassuring. But today I'm supposed to magically love my enemies. And just to be clear, I'm not really aware that I have any enemies personally. If you are one of my enemies, please present yourself after worship. Don't hide. But short of enemies, I wondered what that really meant for me today. Short of enemies who wanted me dead or something. I thought about how we are told who our enemies are, how we are told our enemies are people who live in other lands. Lands we probably have not been to. Terrorists and Iranians and Afghanis and North Koreans and others. I am told to fear them. And I am told to fear the next nutcase who's going to put a bomb on an airplane, which although I still travel with this in my mind, every time I enter the cabin door, I read that sign above it. I don't know if you see it. It says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And as I said on September 12th, 2001, and on September 13th, 2001, and so on, I am not sure I can love those enemies who leave destruction and death in their wake. And closer to home, I wonder if I can love enemies who wear white supremacist armbands and walk into Sikh temples with guns. I wonder if I can love those who proudly declare that there was never a Holocaust, denying that a number of my Jewish relatives were hunted and died in the forests of the Ukraine in the name of Hitler. I wonder if people in College Station today can love the person who shot their loved ones won a Unitarian from the fellowship there. I wonder if our church in College Station can say this morning in worship, we must love our enemies. I cannot love those enemies that I have never met, or those who spit venom in the human world, or those who recklessly destroy the natural world for personal gain. I cannot love those who enslave women or militarize borders or use fear to subjugate the vulnerable. I cannot love the rapist or murderer of a family member. I just can't. And that failure rubs against my liberal theology and spiritual life, which asks me to see no us and them as I preached last week, to embrace the world's suffering and to see the suffering of perpetrators of crimes as well. So this is where the confrontation with evil occurs in our dialogue, where we are called upon for a Unitarian Universalist response to evil. We who wear shirts and march in parades with banners that say, "Standing on the side of love," cannot ignore the woes of the world and the realities of the world. A UU theology on evil, from my point, then looks like this. Evil exists and will always exist, and it is bound together with good. Where room is made for good, room is made for evil. Where justice prevails, evil lurks. And evil is that which threatens meaningful human existence and restricts freedom by coercion. And it is ours when we make the mistake of relinquishing our ability to organize responsible dissent, to stand up to that which is life-degrading and coercive. Evil shows up threatening human life or the environment, but we participate in it when we give up our rights and our freedoms to say something about it, or stand with those who are victimized by those forces. We participate in evil if we see freedoms eroded and stand by silently. And by this, I don't mean the freedom to do or say what you want, but rather the freedom to uphold human dignity, to make choices and to speak our minds. Evil for me is the obscuration of mutuality and the highest form of self-interest. Unitarian Universalists have always said that while evil is real, though it is not pure. And this is what I mean, and this is an important distinction for us. We believe we can sin, but we are not the sin itself. And this is the crack through which we might love our enemies. And if not love them, then get behind ways to reform and make right the wrongs that are in our lives. You see, our humility is a key. Our ability to see that our so-called enemies also have dignity and freedom and rights is the beginning. Are you still with me? But truthfully, all that theology leads to this. To shrink the problem of having to love enemies, we first have to know who they might be. Today, I believe that our enemies are not people in far-off lands, those who cause trouble on borders, per se, that we will never walk, but those who cause us pain and suffering in our own lives. Have you ever been in a lawsuit you knew was unnecessary, but the power dynamics were against you and the intent felt like retribution? Have you been on that other side of that? Have you ever been in a relationship where your lover or partner became your enemy because you chose a different path to pursue different values, different ways of being? Did you ever work for someone you thought was manipulative and angry and vengeful and caused you pain and suffering? Have you ever been to a Yankee game? Maybe that last one's not really a good example. And maybe it's too strong to call those people and those examples enemies, but those in our lives who force us back, who stifle who we are, who refuse to discuss important matters, who create in us undue suffering, may be where today's enemies exist. Someone who threatens us, for sure, or simply someone we can't talk with, someone who is abusive, for sure, or just someone who forces us to put up walls and cut off dialogue, who challenges our sense of mutuality. There, again, resides the notion of evil, beyond the fact that we might be our own worst enemies in some cases. There are those who cause pain and suffering, and that is real in my life and in yours. So can you list those enemies now? In the class on Wednesday, we started off saying we have no enemies. And then there are those perceived enemies. Now, if I'm challenging you today, that's a good thing, okay? No, I am preaching to myself too. But I hear us liberal religious people talk about fundamentalist Christians as if they wore armbands and were coming down the street to drag us out of church. While some evangelicals might fantasize about that, few will realize that. And beyond that, most of them are our friends and our family members and our neighbors. And I hear us talk about the other political party, whichever that is for you, no assumptions there. Those people are the enemy. More and more we will perceive that as we run up to November. And I hear agnostics and atheists in this church speak as if theists are their enemies. And I hear theists in this church talk as if atheists and agnostics are their enemies. And I hear East Dallas folks talk as if Highland Park people are their enemies. And I hear bicyclists talk about runners that way, and runners talk about bicyclists, and motorists talk about runners and bicyclists that way, and so on and so on. And these perceptions grow into animosity and walls between us, the evil that breaks down our mutuality. The key here is that we can change that. And Armstrong gives us 4 responses to help us get closer to the high bar of loving our enemies, real or otherwise. She follows the Chinese book of statecraft, the Tao Te Ching, and says it teaches 4 things. If you want this list, Cindy has a copy of it afterwards, so don't get too upset about this. Okay. She says, master your own greed and egotism. A sage ruler does not try to make the people what he wants them to be, but knows who he is and where he fails. Appreciate the wisdom of restraint toward the enemy. Disarm the enemy by firm appreciation of him without resorting to hopeless self-destructive responses. Dislike the enemy's actions and commitments, but not the enemy himself. And here the Unitarian says, the sinner is not the sin, but has in him illness or suffering. Here Armstrong says we can use the ancient use of the word love in love your enemies to mean be helpful or loyal or supportive without giving over one's own soul or safety. And lastly, find the undercurrent of pain in your enemy's story. To wish for them happiness is perhaps the greatest achievement with the greatest impact. Now, these are difficult spiritual tasks, master's level compassionate work that could take a lifetime to create, to cultivate, but will be a blessing on each of us when we arrive there. I guarantee it. This loving our enemies stuff is difficult to do. So in the end, I go back to two simple statements in this book, one on page 23 and one on page 184. Armstrong wrote, "We are addicted to our egotism. We cannot think how we would manage without our pet hatreds and prejudices that give us such a buzz of righteousness. Like addicts," she says, "we have come to depend on the instant rush of energy and delight we feel when we display our cleverness by making an unkind remark, and the spurt of triumph when we vanquish an annoying colleague. We are addicted," she says, and we need 12 steps to a compassionate life like an addict needs 12 steps to kicking a habit. And the Dalai Lama says very plainly, whether a person is a religious believer does not matter much. Far more important is that they be a good human being. In the end, Armstrong encourages us not to let our hatred become an alter ego, a part of our identity. She says the people we hate haunt us. They inhabit our minds in a negative way as we brood in a deviant form of meditation on their bad qualities. The enemy thus becomes our twin. We can do this work, but we need to practice. And that has been the point the whole summer. So I encourage you that to become a compassionate human being is a lifelong process, a struggle, but it is within reach. We can build up mutuality in our lives. We can combat our egos and our greed and our hatred. We can, in the end, have no enemies at all because we have matured past the need for enemies. We can either befriend our enemies, Wendell Berry says, or we can die with them. And the absolute triumph of the absolute horror constructed by us to save us from them. To which his sister replied in the poem, "Tough, but all right. We'll be nice to the sons of bitches." Okay, if that's a starting point, so be it. Let us begin now, not end the journey toward a compassionate life. Let us begin to study compassion in each of our interactions, in every moment of our lives, because perhaps it may be the only thing that will save us. Good wishes to you, friends. Amen.